So hi again, Frank.
Good morning, Kristen.
By the way, we may be interrupted by thunderstorms. There were some
No.
green and yellow and orange things coming towards both of us.
Uh-oh.
So, but I don't
It's
think it
summertime.
happens until like 1 o'clock, so we should be okay. All right, so today's episode number 5, is about how to manage developers and other tech-savvy specialists. And both you and I deal with those kind of folks all day long.
That's right.
Some of your folks are deeper technically than some of our folks because we tend to focus mostly on the web and web development. You're building applications, and they run the gamut from from games and education and that type of thing, all the way up to very sophisticated military security kinds of apps, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a
All right.
broad audience.
Yes, broad audience. And you've been doing it a long time. Both of us have been in this for decades on the tech side.
And your business has become more and more and more of a tech business over the past however many years. It's not just people business anymore.
Yeah, it was really good. You know, that when I was selling machine shop tools, and I was so embarrassed in one of my first calls, and I didn't know what I was selling. And the old guy said, you know, if you don't understand what you're selling, you shouldn't even be selling. And I just decided that was my vow. You know, you make vows in your life to learn more about technology and sales and marketing. And I'm still doing that.
It never stops changing.
It never stops changing. Learning. Yeah. And little did I think I'd be running an agency with 30 people in it, you know, doing technical marketing. I mean, it's just, one never knows.
That's right.
Okay, so the first thing I thought we should talk about, and as we've discussed, is the leadership. We have to start at the top because this whole series is aimed at managers, company owners, departmental managers, VPs, anybody who's in a management position. And I think we need to talk about millennials and how they're different from baby boomers a little bit. There's been a lot of jokes about that, like that interview where some old guy is interviewing a young girl and she goes, 8 o'clock? You want me here at 8 o'clock? I'm not even up to Starbucks by 8 o'clock. So
most humor is based in truth.
Huh?
Most humor is based in truth. But
yes, there's some truth in
just fundamental differences in the way people approach the world nowadays.
Yes, but I've also found there's a lot of commonality. So if you do hire people of good character who like to work hard and they're trying to make something of their lives, the gap is, outside of joking around about, you know, how I'm old and you're not, and just wait till you get to my age, I don't find much difference. What's been your experience?
Pretty much the same. I agree that the humor is ill-founded. You know, they're just jokes, but if people of any age are interested in what they do, are motivated to do it well, and in particular, internally motivated to do things well, it's going to be the same regardless of the generation. I don't think it's that. I mean, you know, some of the smaller quirks are almost entertaining, like what we'll call, I guess, the younger generation. To you and I tend to have an aversion to making phone calls. They'll text, they'll chat, they'll Slack, they'll email, but if you tell them just get on the phone and call the customer, it takes a little nudging. And once they do it, they'll be fine. So there are certainly differences. There are always generational differences. When I started out, I was the 19-year-old in a building full of crusty old engineers building airplanes. They made jokes about me. So there's always going to be generational differences. But if you find the right people, they're going to be hardworking, driven, internally motivated, and good workers and good performers.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing I have found, though, is that because they don't have a whole lot of experience, at least decades worth, and because they can look things up on Google really easily and be smart in 2 seconds, you have to be careful that you give very clear instructions, because you can't assume they know what they don't know, or what they, you know, that old thing that Rumsfeld said once about, you know what you don't know, and we don't know.
Unknown unknowns.
Yes, yes. So you can't assume that they know things, and you just have to apologize to them and say, you probably already know this, but I just want to make sure that this, and this is how we do this. And in my case, I have a lot of millennials and younger and a little older working for me, the whole range. And we just make sure we document everything, not only for that reason, but because your whole situation can change. Somebody, and in my case, I have a lot of virtual people, and suddenly their husband is relocated in the military to Spain and they're not available for a few months or something. So everything has to be documented and very clearly. You just can't assume anything about what people expect to do or how they are expected to do it.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things there, and it's interesting. And the first is virtual teams. There's more and more of that today. And sometimes I run hot and cold on when that works and when that doesn't, but oftentimes it's just a reality. And what you're describing, I think, is process. It's proceduralizing the things that you do regularly, making sure everybody understands how things work here. Ahead of that, you talked about, they run to Google. I think what you're touching on is recent generations have established sort of a just-in-time learning culture, which is great. I mean, it's remarkable how much you can learn. And if you have a mindset of saying, how hard can something be? Let me go out to Mr. Google here and see how to do that and figure it out and watch a couple of YouTube videos. And they can learn the techniques very quickly when needed. And that's a good thing. I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing. I think what you're probably referring to is there can be a tendency to always assume that whatever I learned a year ago is different now. Let me learn a different way to do it and not establish any sort of a pattern to doing things. And one of the unfortunate realities of life that I find myself having to teach some of the newer generation is that sometimes it makes sense from a business perspective to do things in a way we've done before, even if there's been some change. And even if there might be better ways to do it, and you shouldn't ignore the better ways to do it. We'll set up a sort of a separate project to try some of those things out. But for now, this is the process that we follow, and let's get this project done this way. So it's a bit of a balancing act because you don't want to stifle innovation. You don't want to keep people from going out and looking for new ways of doing things. You do want to teach them that sometimes the hot, shiny new thing isn't quite right, or maybe it's not quite fully baked yet, and you shouldn't just jump into it. So let's experiment with that while we continue to do things the way we know works. And from a management perspective, it's kind of that little bit of orchestrating. How do you keep them productive, keep them working together, but not quelch any sort of innovation or sense of the fun of doing this?
Yeah, I agree. That's all very good points. And as a manager, you have to keep reminding them of the reasons that you're doing things, sort of the bigger picture. Because until you've been a manager for a long time, you don't even understand what it means to keep coming back to the bigger picture. So I find myself getting really simple about certain things. Although I will say it's not just generational. I was talking to someone who is a baby boomer business owner who's more of an engineer than a marketing or salesperson. And they're hiring a new sales manager, and he's working on compensation. And I keep finding people want to complicate sales compensation. I mean,
oh Lord, yeah, it's
huge
like piles of software have been written to try and handle all that stuff.
Yeah, and if this, then that, if this, then that. But to me, that confuses the sales force. And I know I'm getting a little off topic here, but it does relate. The first thing I said to him is, wait, are they bringing in more sales or not? Okay. After that, you can bonus them a little bit here and there and divide things up. Maybe there's some requirements that you have where you want to go after certain markets or you want more distributors and things like that. So there are definitely nuances about what you want, but there always should be an overriding, emphasized point that says, this is our most important thing. So that even while they're working and making decisions, with you not in the room micromanaging them, they'll make the right decision And I mean, even things like it's okay to make mistakes. Now, obviously, I don't run around and say, oh, make mistakes. I don't encourage it, and I hire good people and they don't want to make mistakes. But the thing that they keep commenting on is that if they do, the first thing we do is we fix it.
Yeah, right.
The first thing I do is not put my hands on my hips and get all upset, because what's the point? They made the mistake and we learn from it. And I teach everyone else, okay, guys, you have to be careful when you put your IP address into this little directory that says, you know, we're not going to follow our own IP addresses. Make sure you don't put a slash at the end, because that'll turn off all the tracking for all the clients in Google. You know, the web is, and by the way, that's one of the trickiest parts, I think, about managing in this day and age, is the technology is fussy. It's like a 3-year-old who's in a no mood. No, I don't want that. You can't do that. That one little slash had an enormous ramification.
Yeah, it's quirky. And it's fascinating because we're kind of drifting down into a very larger topic on management. There's really a couple of layers to this. There's managing, there's mentoring, and there's leadership. Sometimes people need to be managed. No, Bob, put this here, do that, do the next thing. Sometimes they need to be taught and mentored. And most often they need to be led. They need to understand what the goals are, and then given enough mentoring and management that they can achieve those goals independently. And then you can lead them by just changing the goals. It's a fascinating process, and there's no one set of rules. I think you use the word micromanaging at some point. Nobody likes to have to do that, and nobody likes to be micromanaged. But then there's all those piles of experience like you had. Well, no, I know that if you put that slash there, it's a problem. So you're constantly teaching there. You can't take your eye off the ball. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
I love what you just said about those 3 things. I'm going to have to quote you somewhere, because that's really good, Frank. I've never heard anybody put it quite that way. So we're going to pull that out and put it all over somewhere.
Another topic.
Yeah. No, that's very good. And I think it is important to keep track of that, because one of the other things that happens is people are used to managing certain types of people a certain way.
Right.
So anybody who starts a business has a background in one of the business disciplines. They've been in engineering or sales or finance, and they managed things a certain way in those capacities. But we're finding a lot of people who are, I almost said cross-dressing, but that's not the term.
No.
No, they're going into multiple areas. Like a chief financial officer might be put in charge of operations, or even marketing. We're finding that some of that is happening, because marketing has become so metric driven.
Right.
And suddenly a financial guy finds himself leading or trying to manage creative types.
Right.
That's a whole different thing from their perspective.
And there's a larger element to all of this, because all the stuff we've been talking about in these past few shows is about things that our audience, for the most part, I'm assuming, don't do as part of their actual business. Their business is to build things, ship products, deliver on services that are different than what we're talking about. And then when you go to add these capabilities to that mix, it's a different sort of management. It's a different sort of leadership. And it does shift constantly, as you said, as online marketing has become more and more metrics driven. It does seem to fit more into the what's the word?
Operations.
Yeah, there was a different word I was trying to reach for, but yeah, the operational side of the house, the analytical side of the house. But that's perhaps just from managing the data and drawing conclusions from it, but you don't necessarily want to carry along the other skill sets with that to say that now the CFO is also trying to manage the art department, as you said. It's a shifting landscape and hard to keep up with.
Mm-hmm. And the influence of technology, the absolute integration. You can't do anything in marketing now without some brush in with technology or an immersion into technology. It's just impossible. So one of the things, besides the clear instructions and leadership, I've also noticed that there's a tendency to over-evaluate or over-discuss items. It's almost like we want to have all the right data before we make a decision. And in this age of, oh, I'm smart about that in 2 seconds in Google, people just want to know, what do you want me to do right now?
Right.
So you really have to get really good at making pretty good decisions with the data that you have. Obviously, you still send somebody out and say, okay, take a look at these 3 things. Like one of the things I was going to talk about is every business needs an app whisperer now.
Yes.
You know, and I have one. It's the first person I hired was somebody who's good at infrastructure, good at evaluating software applications, because we're all running our whole business on the web. And you really have to be able to say, okay, this one does that, that one does this. Do I need, so there's the decision between which one you buy. And then how do we integrate them properly to actually accomplish what we want to do? And it's harder than you think. It's just incredibly difficult. I'm using 3 different programs right now and integrating them to get an ironclad real-time job costing situation, so I can see, you know, if we're on target with that estimate at this moment, and then feed that into invoicing. And with all my technical background, it still is a slog.
Yeah, it's always sort of been the case in enterprise software in general that the tools never quite deliver on the promises, and people had to get really smart at the tools. A few years ago, or probably more than a few years ago, the choice of tools were limited, and businesses made pretty much immutable choices and said, okay, we are now an SAP shop and we're going down that path, and we build a team of experts and they just have to beat the thing in submission, whereas someone else would have done that with PeopleSoft or JD Edwards or something. There's so many more choices now, and the landscape changes so quickly that you have opportunities to make changes in midstream or try new things. And you do need people who are comfortable with that. You call them app whisperers, but it's really people who are comfortable enough with technology to say, sure, I'll try that. Do a pilot, do a test, set up an example, try it out, get some data back and say, you know what, this is promising, or you know what, this is a dead end, and toss it aside and try the next one. It's still true that pretty much nothing out there is as complete as you would want it to be, or as complete as its vendor claims it is, but you can experiment more quickly and change more quickly. And a lot of this hovers around things we've spoken about in prior episodes. We talked about agile development and being agile, and I think we spoke about it mostly in the context of developing this stuff, but it actually applies to the whole business. Our world is fluid enough that we have got to be able to act quickly and react quickly and change and try again. And the younger generation has sort of been, I don't want to say schooled in that, but heard it almost to their detriment. You've heard the phrase fail fast, fail often, all the Silicon Valley stuff. And on the level that those things are talked about, it's a whole different domain, but people internalize that as, well, of course we're going to fail and we're going to try again. And that's a healthy attitude. If it's managed well, try something. If it doesn't work, change, try again. We've got so much data coming in. You can measure the results of what you're doing and make corrections. Back in the day, you might spend 6 or 9 months setting up some whole marketing campaign and running commercials and ads and so forth, and it would take you a year to find out if it did any good. In the digital domain, you can find out in a week or 2. So you've got to be prepared to change a lot and to be agile with a lowercase a. Just be agile in everything that you do.
Yeah, that's good. I think part of this all came about when the web started becoming more and more popular, and you know, it really came into its own in 1994, and then started branching out more and more into business and becoming where it is now, where the web basically is the cloud, and we're all operating on that environment and running our businesses on it. But one of the things I noticed, having worked with engineers for many years before the web, is that an engineer working on something physical, and you talk about this a lot, if you're building a bridge, you have to make sure that it's not going to break when a certain number of cars get on it. And it's a very serious, the ramifications are very serious, and changing or fixing or redoing that, super serious, not just physically, but legally and all of that. With the web, You can put up a site in a couple of days if you want to, and change it within an hour or two and put it on a whole new template. So everything is fixable. And that's a different mindset. I think it causes people to just assume that, okay, it's not a big deal. Why are we following all these processes? Why are you so ironclad about these processes?
Right. But like everything else in life, it's a balance. Because there are things you can do that are irreversible. And there's been plenty of high profile examples of companies tweeting something out that turned out to be stupid or to offend someone. And we're talking about big established companies. I can't remember any examples off the top of my head, but they've happened. So it's incumbent on the leadership to recognize where you have to be very deliberate and very careful and where you can be agile. And you talked before about overanalyzing things, and that's not new to this generation. People have had analysis paralysis since the first cavemen sat around a rock trying to figure out if it would roll. But it can be worse now, in part because it's also coupled sometimes with what they call approach anxiety in aviation, where you're just afraid to act because you don't know where it's going to lead. And so it's easier just to hang back and analyze it. But to be able to discern which decisions are the higher risk ones that perhaps can't be reversed, and do be careful with those, versus which ones are fluid and amenable to an agile approach and to testing and trying, and letting those move forward without a lot of drag. So it's not getting easier for leadership.
That's
Actually,
the truth.
I have a New Yorker cartoon in my conference room that shows 6 dogs sitting around a conference table with a ball in the middle of the table, and one of them says, "Perhaps we're overthinking this." and it's a good reminder to me sometimes, is like to always ask the question, is this something that really needs to be carefully analyzed, or can we just go try this?
Yeah, and involving the team in the decision helps.
Yes.
And I think that today's folks are more socially aware. I mean, we've got social media, we have all this sharing, they live their whole life on these sharing apps. In one way, some people say it's less community because you're not interacting virtually, or personally rather. But it's just expected that you're going to have a network of people that you interact with. And I guess this segues us into working virtually versus having people in-house. You tend to have more people in-house.
We do. But we've got others, we've got several offices, which is effectively working remotely, working virtually. And we do have a few people working. It's much easier to achieve good productivity that way now, has been. Even in the earlier days of internet-based workers and people working remotely, the connectivity wasn't great. We didn't have things like Slack. We didn't have reliable video like we're doing now. The tools weren't quite there. The tools now are much better. So it's really more about culture and more about leadership and more about the people. Some people work well that way. Some people don't. You have to sort of discern that. And from a management perspective, it's a slippery slope, because if you let Bob work remotely, then how come you're telling Jane that she can't? Those are challenges that are outside the scope of this talk. But the technology is such that you can do it effectively now, and lots of people do.
Yeah, we are 100% virtual, and Slack has become a godsend for us, because it really is set up so that you can just pop in, ask a question, you get an immediate answer or not, that's okay. I have an acronym that I made up, which is, it stands for ignore me until you are working. It's a weird little acronym that you can't actually say. But people know that that's me in all caps saying, listen, I'm just working this weekend, which I tend to do. And if you're not, that's fine. Some people do, some people don't. But then that gives them the grace basically to say, oh, well, she doesn't need this right away. So that's been useful. And there's a lot of mismanners kinds of things and I don't know if anybody younger than us will remember mismanners. It's self-explanatory. There are procedures within every community, and Slack is a community. If you make good use of channels versus the personal The channels tend to stay up longer, and you can go back to them, and everybody on the channel sees everything that you're talking about. You can set up internal channels so that it's just us talking about what we need to do for a client. And then once we're settled, then we go out to the client. But it's a fantastic tool, and it helps everybody communicate with each other, just like walking down the hall. I always thought we'd be fine if we could just get an app that was just like popping down the hall, popping your head in.
It's close.
It's close.
It's close.
It's very close. Very well done.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I still tend to favor having the team together because there's a level of interaction, of casual interaction or impromptu interaction that you just don't quite get with a purely virtual team, but they do both work for many reasons.
So let's talk about hiring. We've so far been talking a lot about management. Let's talk about hiring. I actually have a jerk test, which I'm not going to talk about because then I'd be giving it away, that I use in all my interviews. And it's literally, it's never failed me. I've been using it for, I don't know, decades, I guess. And I ask a question, depending on the answer, I know right away if the person is a jerk or not. It's really useful because I have a jerk-free team. And my experience about jerks in the business environment is there's usually about 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 15 are jerks. So I should define a jerk. A jerk is a person who makes things difficult for everybody else. And that's the opposite of a nice person who tries to make things easier for everybody else. It's a decision that you make early in life and how you're going to behave in certain situations. And by making sure, and even if I make a mistake, which I have once or twice, there were people who didn't quite pass the jerk test, but I really wanted them, and well, they turned out to be jerks, and you have to let them go quickly. So
always listen to that internal voice, right?
Yeah. That's another, oh yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's another decision that you need to make really, really quickly because the team will get dragged down by the jerk. And they won't tell you right away that the person is being a jerk, which is too bad, but they won't. And so you have to depend on your own intuition to start realizing that somebody out there is putting his or her hands on their hips and making everybody else feel small or inadequate or not giving them all the information, just doing stupid things that make it harder for everybody to do their work.
Absolutely. And I've never voiced it the way you do when we hire, but we look for very, very similar things there. We wrap it in highfalutin sounds, phrases like teamwork and, collaboration and all that, but no jerks is a good way to summarize it. It's probably safe to say our audience is generally good at hiring because they're all experienced business owners. But what's particularly difficult about the domains we're talking about here, especially for businesses who haven't previously touched on technologies like this, is that this industry sort of encourages jerks. There's been a lot of the culture, particularly on my side of the fence and the programmers thing, the whole programmer thing that you've heard about and reading about Uber, it's real. There's this weird kind of culture that has fostered the growth of the super programmer who's almost always what you would call a jerk and not generally a good fit for anything but the biggest and most complex of companies. Like I'm sure Google's got plenty of people like that in there, but they're very good at managing those sorts of things, but not somebody you'd want to hire into a small to medium-sized business. So we deal with that a lot in my industry, and we're pretty good at filtering that out. I would imagine, though, the way your industry has changed, become more tool-driven, become more data-driven, it's another invitation for people to come in and cop an attitude and say, I know everything and you know nothing. And people like that are often very good at selling themselves in an interview and trying to see through the bluster to whether there's, underlying empathy, underlying, ability to work in a team, or is this person really going to set off your jerk trigger? It's a little hard sometimes because they often do interview well. And this is true whether they're interviewing to be an employee or interviewing to be a contractor or a consultant or anything. It takes a lot of work to see through that.
I agree with you. I think that people of this, the younger generation has been more exposed to marketing, advertising, socializing, and so they've developed these wonderful skills. And you're right, the few times that I've made that mistake, the person interviewed very well.
Mm-hmm.
And we also really wanted to fill that position. Then that's a mistake. I mean, you're just so excited that you found somebody that has the skills. But if you hire skills over character, you're really going to be hurting your good people. And
Yes, you can teach skills. You
yes.
generally can't teach character unless you get them really young.
Yeah. Well, we're not hiring them when they're 7 years old. So.
No, but seriously, that's one of the reasons I spent a lot of my time with local high schools and in the tech and IT programs in the high schools to expose these students very early as to what the right way to go about a career in this business is, so that they don't get, and you'd be surprised at how many 11th graders I've encountered who are already practicing very bad personality, I guess, whatever. They're already jerks. They're just kids, but they've picked up bad habits from various places, and it takes some work. It takes some work to turn them around.
Yeah, and people who spend time in front of computer screens all day messing with code are not necessarily people who are learning social skills anyway.
Right.
So this whole Silicon Valley, push hard, swagger around, it hasn't done anybody any favors in the work environment.
Not for small to mid-sized businesses who just need to get a particular kind of work done. If you're out to change the world by whatever, building the Airbnb of fill in your blank, fine. If you're just trying to build your business or keep your business alive or keep growing and do good stuff, you need a different type of person.
Yeah, but even the Airbnb people, if a company like that becomes famous, and then the CEO is sitting there, in stages with Walt Mossberg from the Wall Street Journal or whoever's the latest version of Walt, or they're doing things that are just jerky. I mean, even poor Mark Zuckerberg has had people put words in his mouth now with that video where he was talking and saying, "I've taken over your life." So, or somebody smoking pot on a radio interview in a video. I mean, these things backfire.
They do. And then we're talking about personality quirks at the highest levels, and we could do a whole other show on that.
Yeah, we could.
And is that effective leadership? I can tell you without any doubt, it's not effective leadership for a small to medium-sized business.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You might be able to pull that off if you're Elon Musk, or that's just a different world. And that's really the point I was making about, if you're out to do that, and you can get away with those kinds of people. But if you've got a small to mid-sized business and you just need to grow and succeed, you need a different kind of person on your team.
Speaking of which, again, you're right. A lot of the audience for these webinars are people who have been in business a long time and have hired people, a lot of people. But one thing I'm noticing is you really do have to understand the nature of certain technical jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are outward facing people and there are the more shy, I just want to do that very specific work, but I don't really want to interact with a lot of people all day long.
Right.
Or the more creative types. And you have to ask questions about the kinds of things they love doing early on in the process and then test them out for those types of things. I have hired people who have said, "Oh, I love that. I really enjoy doing that." And then you get them and they're okay at it, but they really are better at this other thing that we could use them for. And so I move them. I'm always, even when I did marketing and sales department turnarounds for big companies, I would sit people down the first day and say, "What do you love doing and what drives you crazy that you'd rather not do?" And then try to work the jobs so that they get to do what makes them happy every day. And that really brings loyalty. I haven't had any trouble with loyalty because I really do want to make sure they're happy. That's
just good leadership and good talent management. And that applies across the board to any type of job responsibilities. Mm-hmm. One of the things that people tend to respond to the bluster and respond to people talking about how great they are certainly in my end of the business, but we always go back and look at actual work product. We subject our candidates to tests, to online coding tests if they're interviewing at that level. We look at prior work. In our case, we tend to favor developers who have prior work that they can show. It's not just, well, I did this at this company, I can't talk about it, but on my own time, I built this open source library for doing such and such, and here's my GitHub link, and you can go read about it. We see those things. It's a chance to see not only are they passionate about the work because they do this for fun as well as for employment, but it gives you a tangible evidence of what they're capable of doing. A good slice of your business has always been that way. Show me your portfolio. Show me work you've done before. Show me websites you've built. Some of the more analytics side, a little harder. I imagine you can test them in some ways. You can, give them a chance to show what they're actually capable of. But you can't just listen to what they say about themselves. It's too easy in this world to build up false capability just by reading a bunch of stuff. It's out there. You can watch a bunch of YouTube links and then just parrot that back in an interview and sound great. You've got to somehow test to get beneath the surface of that.
Yeah, and you did a beautiful job there of going into our next topic, which is how to tell if you've got a good developer or how to hire good developers. So I think one of the things that you've said to me in previous conversations is the code has to make sense. The code has to look good. And it's very difficult for a business manager to look at code and say, that's good code or that isn't. Do you have any hints at all for them about that?
That's not easy. You can get a sense from an interview and from looking at someone's code if this person is bad at it because things will just look messy and maybe they're not able to describe it to you well. They can't form thoughts clearly. You can pick out a bad one, but if the code looks clean to you and neatly formatted and the person seems to describe it well, it's kind of hard for a non-developer to actually assess whether this person is in fact good at what they're doing or is just good at presenting this.
I have an interesting thought. If you talking to a programmer and they say, here's what I designed, rather than have them show you, I would be much more interested, if it's possible, if it's something you could actually use, to try to use the program with them, with you trying to use the program with them sort of in the background saying, oh, well, that's why I did this and that.
Oh, that would be ideal if the opportunity presented itself.
Yeah, because it is the end result that's most important. Is the navigation somewhat standard? Is the search box in the upper right where it is expected to be? Mm-hmm. Things like that. One of the things that I'm doing right now is I finally gave in and went back to QuickBooks to do sort of job costing and everything. I talked about that earlier today. And I'm remembering why I left QuickBooks 20 years ago. It's because they had programmers work on, as far as I can tell, they worked on different parts of the program. And the navigation for doing the next thing, like finding, usually you'd go up to a gear to try to change the settings somewhere. And there are at least 4 different ways to do that in any one of the modules in QuickBooks. Mm-hmm. And it's even aggravated by the fact that they have a large number of plugins, which is very nice. But they also have the same problem where when you're in this part of that module, you go up here to change that. But when you're in that part of the module, you go over there to change that. So you can never memorize. In fact, you have to memorize how to do the navigation. And that's a sign of bad programming in my mind. That's one of the things.
It would be if somebody wrote something from scratch like that. Mm-hmm. Here, it's just a sign of, bad is a tough term, but it's an illustration of the difficulty of product management of a huge application like QuickBooks over its long history. It's just really hard to keep up with a product like this. And this is why many software vendors, every some number of years, will just stop and rewrite what they've got and do a fresh version. And this does happen a lot in the industry. Our audience may be experiencing that with the software that got them to where they are today, that somebody built. And I think I've used this example before. 15 years ago, somebody built the Fox Pro app that we use for our inventory, and then we added a bunch of things onto it and some spread, and it just grows over time. And it reaches a point where it's incredibly difficult to use and perhaps unreliable and just a little bit shaky. It's a similar problem. It's a little hard to judge an individual developer on that sort of thing. If you're talking to somebody about building you a website and they can take you to some publicly reachable website that they built for somebody else and walk you through it, and, or actually, to your example, allow you to walk yourself through it, and you can ask them questions and you can judge how they respond to that, that's terrific. You don't often get that opportunity, but it's great if you can do that. When we're interviewing programmers, sometimes it's difficult because perhaps their last job, but just working on some internal piece of some very large thing, and they can't really show us that. But I think I mentioned earlier that we look for developers who also do this for fun. And very often they'll say, but I have this game I wrote and it's in the Google Play Store and it does this and this. Want me to show you that? And they'll walk us through that. And you can get a tremendous sense of how good they are by how they show you their work, by how they walk you through it. And they can perhaps walk you through the code. And you can actually get that feel from them if you yourself are not an experienced programmer. So yeah, there are ways, but it's a lot harder to interview and judge highly technical people if you don't have some facility with the technology yourself, which is why if you're not a technologist or you're not in that particular branch of technology, you should perhaps start by bringing in somebody to lead that capability and let them hire the people to actually do the work. Don't try to just bring in somebody to write some code for you first and then grow later. You'll probably regret it.
Okay, so we're just about done. I wanted to bring up one other thing, well, actually two things, and that's how to make good decisions. So you're sitting here trying to figure out if this is the right person or this is the right app, and how are we going to make all these things work together. And I have two really important pieces of advice. One is, don't let them snow you by saying, oh, well, don't worry your pretty little head about it, kind of thing, where something doesn't make sense to you. Keep asking. Just keep asking, because all of this stuff actually does make sense. At some level, it makes sense. And it's actually good for them to learn how to explain those things.
That's right.
It's not just the baby boomer business owners who would have trouble understanding things. There's a lot of millennials and younger and even in the middle that don't understand. Nobody understands everything. I mean, you and I have been in this for decades, and we still learn. I learn something new every single day.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the reasons I still do this, is it's fun to learn things.
Yeah.
But I'm going to turn around what you said just a little bit.
Sure.
And say that if the person you're asking to explain this stuff to you resists explaining it to you, they're probably not very good at it and they're afraid of something. Because anybody who's really good at this not only enjoys explaining what they did, but they also enjoy trying to scale down their explanation to the level of experience of the person they're talking to. One of the best people I've ever worked with was like that. He could dial the detail up and down in real time based on his judgment of how much the person he was talking to understood about what he was saying. And that's a great skill. And people who are really good at their work enjoy doing that. And so if you ask somebody, walk me through this, explain to me how this works, and they go, you would never understand this, you probably don't want to work with that person. You want them to be excited about showing it to you, and about showing it to you in a way that you understand. And that's a pretty important skill.
You're absolutely right. And it's a big deal for businesses like ours, where we are providing services. And those services turn into, in your case, applications, in my case, campaigns, websites, and so on. They become tangible parts of their business. And if they don't understand them, they can't manage them. They can't make good decisions about them. So it really, the onus is on us to be able to explain those things in the kind of detail where somebody, or at the right level where somebody says, okay, I've got that. I do that a lot, all day.
Oh yeah. But the onus is on them also to ask the questions.
Yes.
I love when customers ask us. I mean, we try to over deliver in that regard anyway, and involve them in meetings and involve them in discussions. But when someone calls up and says, can you explain to me why this? I'm thrilled, because we want them to understand this stuff. It's not in your best interest as the client to just take everything your service provider says as gospel and hope it all works out. You need to test, you need to query.
Well, in fact, by the time people come to me for marketing, digital marketing services, they've already been through the phases of somebody where they just gave it up to them and said, go do a search engine optimization or go do socializing or whatever. And thousands of dollars later, they don't even know what they did. They don't know how it works. You cannot manage what you don't understand. So
right.
Always ask questions. Always be asking is what we talk about it in our own company.
Yes, and there's a tendency in our worlds for people who aren't familiar with what we do to want to believe that they can just trust us.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But what was I don't know how to say in Russian, but trust but verify, the Ronald Reagan thing. People would allow us or people like us, to run freely on things when those same people would want to analyze or be involved in every step of the process when they're building a new factory or renovating their home or other areas where they may not have direct experience doing the work, but they can understand it well enough to be inquisitive and to be involved. There's a tendency to just let people like us free wheel, and that's just a bad idea.
Yeah, and it is all learnable. I keep coming back to that. It does take time. You do have to invest in it, but all of this stuff is learnable. Nobody woke up, nobody got born knowing how to program.
Right.
People learned how to make websites, and you could say, oh, well, it's the younger ones and they're used to, no, it's learnable. So don't let anybody say to you, don't worry your pretty little head about it.
Right. And there's learnable to a level of understanding the work other people are doing to be able to hold them accountable.
Right.
And then there's learnable to be able to do the work yourself. I don't do this work myself anymore either. I haven't coded in, 15 years, but I still understand it all and I keep up with all the latest technologies enough so that I can understand what my guys are doing.
Yes.
And it's the same thing if you're the customer. If you're having that factory built, you're going to know a thing or two about construction, not down to the level of detail where you could do it yourself, but you're going to know what questions to ask because that's your factory.
Yep.
That's your business.
Yeah.
Same thing here. Your marketing, your website, your web app, all those things, those are as important to your business as your factory. You need to learn enough of it to be able to ask those questions.
I totally agree. My last piece of advice, or my second piece of advice on that topic, working with technical people, is diagram. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting with a technical person, like an IT person or something, and I said, okay, now in order to do this, we have to integrate this, this, and this, and we have to build that over here. So we know what our business requirement is, and we need to get this over there. And the person would say, no, can't do it. Knee-jerk IT reaction, can't do it. So I start getting to the whiteboard.
People love for IT people, but you're right. They're the land of no.
I know. It's, well, anybody does that, not just IT people. And you get on the whiteboard and you start diagramming it out. And about halfway through, they start to sit back and say, well, yes, okay, maybe you could do that. Yeah. Well, what if we did this? Could we? Yeah, okay, yes, we could do that. So, their plates are very full. The whole company is running on one or two guys in the back room trying to keep everything alive. When you come in and say, we want to do this, they're just like, oh, please go away. So
that's also a good leadership skill, though, and to ask the questions such that you force the people to explain you things in a simple way. Draw me a picture. I've said that 1,000 times. There's a line from a movie, Denzel Washington, he plays a lawyer. I forget the movie. I think it might be Philadelphia, where he keeps saying, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. So, good leaders and good customers will ask those questions. And it's interesting because you just touched on, circling all the way back to our discussion about remote workers. The one weakness I think still exists with virtual workers is whiteboarding software, although it exists, isn't there yet to where it's as effective as having a bunch of people we have whiteboards all over our office, by the coffee pot, by the kitchen, and people just pick up a pen and start talking. Some offices, they just have glass walls and people can draw on the glass walls. There is whiteboarding software for virtual workers. It doesn't work quite as well. You don't get that sort of interaction. So it's one thing to think about as I go off topic and go back to virtual workers, is that kind of higher level collaboration, drawing me a picture. It's very important to be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The task management software has finally gotten to the point where it's really useful. It's only been 30 years. And I'm really looking for, every so often I go out and try another whiteboarding program or a diagramming program. I just want to be able to draw it on my iPad and we share the screen together and it's super simple. Not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah, they exist, but it's not nearly the same as just grabbing a pen and standing up at the wall. So
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Frank. Well, this has been another wonderful session with you.
a lot
I
of
always
fun.
enjoy it. I guess I don't know what the next one is going to be, but anyway, we're still cranking them out. We still have a lot to talk about, it seems like. And I hope
You can't shut us up.
yeah, that's right. I hope everybody's enjoying these, and if we get feedback, that would be great. If anybody wants us to cover particular topics, we want to know about that, and you can reach us from our websites. So thank you, Frank. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Kristen.
All right.
See you soon.
Bye.